We are joined once again by Vincent Russo with another In the Legal Know. Today in the Legal Know, Vincent will be focusing on home ownership. Vincent, thanks for being with us today. So what's the issue with home ownership?
Okay, so Father, it's a pleasure to be with you, first of all. It's surprising that when clients come into my office for estate planning, and I ask them this simple question, who owns the house? And I get an answer like, I own it, or we own it, we're married, or it's in a trust, or I own it with my child, but we kind of own it together. And then the last answer is, I'm not sure.
Oh. Wow.
And so you think it's the most valuable and important asset that someone has. And there's legal consequences to how you own a home. So it's really important to understand that. So the starting point is the deed. So if you want to know about who owns the house and the type of ownership, look at the deed. And the deed at the very beginning says, I, the grantor, the person who owned the property, transferred the property to the grantee. Okay. That's the current owner. And then look to see what words follow the name of that grantee. And that's going to determine ownership. So then the other question that comes up that I ask is, let me see the deed. And they say, we don't know where it is.
That's what I was just going to ask you. How do we find the deed if we don't know where it is?
That's right. So, all right. So maybe they have a copy, and a copy is good. But otherwise, you can get a copy of the deed, or a certified copy if you want, from the county clerk's office. So that's the starting point to understanding home ownership.
So then, what does that mean then? Once we determine home ownership, how does that affect then the estate planning or anything else that people might want to be thinking about with the asset of the home?
Sure. Then we have to look at the type of ownership, all right? And the basic types of ownership are, you can be a sole owner, meaning you are the single owner of the house, or you're a joint owner. And as a joint owner, there are different types of joint owners. There's a joint owner with right of survivorship. There's a joint owner as tenants in common. And there's joint owners as tenants by the entirety. So it can get complicated.
Well, yes. Why don't can you unpack some of that for us, what each of those things are?
Yes. And I think the easiest way to do this, because I sometimes tend to get a little too complicated, is to do it by example. So let's take John, who owns a home and owns it with his sister Mary. And it's common that once you move on from sole owner, that you'd have a joint owner. It could be siblings, it could be a parent with a child, and they're the joint owners, all right? So they own it together equally, and they have rights in the home. Then the question becomes, well, often, what happens when one passes away? And that's where those differences come in. So you are automatically treated as joint owners with tenants in common if it just said, let's say John's sibling is Mary and they own it together. So it's John and Mary, and the deed says John and Mary are the grantees. All right, so they own it together as tenants in common, which means that if one passes away, let's say John passes away, John's half interest passes under his will, or if he doesn't have a will, by intestacy. So his half is owned by John and moves on to other beneficiaries. Okay. Mary continues to own her half. So they own it together, but one dies, it's 50-50, and we don't know. Did John have a will? Who did he leave the home to? Mary may not be happy that John now has his children or a friend of his being a co-owner with Mary.
So she doesn't necessarily become the co-owner just because he predeceased her.
Right. She doesn't become the sole owner. All right. So how does it work so that the survivor becomes the sole owner? So we have a deed. The grantee is Mary and John and Mary, and then we have words after it: joint with right of survivorship. And so that means, just like a joint bank account with right of survivorship, that if John passes away first, Mary now owns the home 100%. Okay. And so it's important to understand, do we have ownership when we own it jointly tenants in common? Well, we said nothing, which makes it tenants in common,
Okay.
or is it with right of survivorship?
Well, what about married couples, though, now, too? Because that's different than a brother and sister that might co-own a home together, right?
Yes, and now we have some special rules
Okay.
that come in. and so when, let's say John marries Sally, and they own the home together. So the grantee is John and Sally. If that's all we say, they own it as tenants by the entirety, which means each of them own a 100% interest in the home. And automatically, if one spouse passes away, the other's 100% owner. Now, there are some advantages to having tenants by the entirety. So let's say John got into trouble with creditors, and the creditor wanted to put a lien on the house. Well, the good news is because he's married and owns the home with Sally, the lien cannot be placed on the house. And if John passes away first, the lien is extinguished. So there's protection there. But if either party wants to sell the house, they need the consent of the other. So, as a married couple, they need to be on the same page, or that's a problem.
Right.
All right? Because they each own 100% of the house, not half the house. So it can get complicated.
Right.
And,
Yeah. And that's what keeps you in business, right? That's right.
yes, we need lawyers
Right.
to come in and explain these consequences. And we just touched on what happens when the property passes when one dies.
Right.
So I want to come back and talk about, well, while they're alive, what are all the consequences?
Sure.
But it's really important that that everyone knows where their deed is, what does it say, and understand the consequences of
But
it.
yes, you're going to have to come back and take the next step. But I just want to give you a chance. You have a webinar coming up, right? We wanted to share a little information about that. It's this Thursday.
No, January 26th.
Oh, sorry, January 26th.
All
yeah.
right.
So what's the topic of the webinar?
Okay, the topic is tax strategies in 2023. Our firm is privileged to be a guest of the Diocese of Rockville Center, and we're doing a webinar series. This is the second one. And it'll be at 1 o'clock on the 26th. It's a webinar, and you can contact the diocese. Barbara Kilargian is the point person on this if you'd like to attend.
Great. Well, thanks, Vincent, so much for being with us again, and we look forward to more information the next time you're with us.